Symposium. My name is Jim Rutka. I'm chair of the Department of Surgery, and it's my great pleasure to help to introduce this session today for all of us. At the very beginning, I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. I've put it up here so you can all read along with me. And so we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Our treaty obligations and commitment include learning about the history of these lands and territory and the structured dispossession that Indigenous nations have been subject to by Canada, and learning about justice, equity, structures of power, and to imagine how to build social relations for a different world. We affirm our solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of this land working towards their self-determination and sovereignty from settler colonialism. Okay, so as mentioned, the 7th, and we've had quite a strong emphasis since I've been chair of surgery for global surgery and for global outreach in our department. We have a prospectus, we have a newsletter, we have a logo. We've built an academic case for global surgery in the Department of Surgery. Here are some of the leaders I've mentioned already. So Dr. Andrew Howard, Avery Nathans, who's online, Lee Arrett I've introduced, and Dr. Mark Bernstein as individuals who have been involved in global surgery around the world. Here's where we are in the world. And you can see the outreach that we have in the Department of Surgery and in many different locales and places. But as good as this looks on paper, you can see there are vast areas of the world, including our own country, North, where we're not particularly omnipresent. So we're going to be discussing that today. And I'm really happy that we have this symposium set up today. So you'll remember that some of our previous speakers include Henry Marsh, who wrote a book called Do No Harm, and his efforts in Ukraine. Andy Leather, the Lancet Commission work on global surgery. Brian Cameron spoke about the challenge of global trauma in the world. Richard Gardner spoke to us about his perspective in global surgery in Ethiopia. And Ewan Harrison more recently spoke about crowdsourcing global cancer data and his work in India and so on. But today we're really pleased that we can put this symposium together on Indigenous healthcare, equity, and education as the theme. And we're so pleased that the Honorable Mr. Megrady could join us today and be with us today. He's on the Zoom call with us, speaking to us from somewhere in the South, and it looks very pleasant where he is, and we'll be delighted to hear from him. I'll be asking Avery Nathans just in a moment to introduce our guest speaker, but the other speakers are listed here on the bottom left side of the panel that you can see, and we're really looking forward to an outstanding panel and speaker presentation today. Just so you know, because the theme is Indigenous healthcare, we have a book club in the Department of Surgery, and we've read these books recently, and it's been wonderful. These are excellent books that I would strongly recommend to you to read either Split Tooth or Seven Fallen Feathers, or both, because they'll give you a very good perspective on current and past issues that have affected our Indigenous peoples. So I really would strongly recommend that you get yourselves informed and continue to read all around this topic that we'll be approaching today. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Avery to help us introduce our guest speaker for today. Avery.
Thanks so much, Jim. First, let me thank you all for joining us. I know we have probably just about 100 people who've registered, and I know more will be tuning in shortly. We're going to have a panel discussion at the end, so please hold your questions or add them to the chat so we can address them later. So, why have a symposium with a focus on Indigenous health in the Department of Surgery? Well, I think, and I think probably all of you believe, we have an obligation to understand our past and fulfill our social responsibilities as surgeons, healthcare providers, and Canadians. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission published 94 calls to action, and only seven focused on health. Some of these calls to action require us to be advocates, but some we can actually action directly, closing healthcare gaps, becoming culturally competent, implementing programs to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals in medicine. This is all within our control, and it begins with awareness. And to this end, we are very fortunate to have a most eminent guest today. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Ovid Megrady. Mr. Megrady is a lawyer and a leading advocate for Indigenous people's rights. He was the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations from 1991 to 97, President of the Manitoba NDP, and has been a key strategist in discussions related to constitutional reform. He's a recognized author, probably add his book to our list, having penned In the Rapids, Navigating the Future of First Nations. And he's also a poet with his collection of poems published as My Silent Drum in 2015. Most recently, he was appointed to the Order of Canada for his advocacy of Indigenous rights and nonviolence, as well as his skillful leadership. Mr. Megrady will be speaking on fractures in Canada's universal healthcare system that injure Indigenous people, jurisdictions, geography, poverty, colonialism, and racism. Mr. Megrady, thank you for your willingness to educate us today, and the podium is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm in a place where you all want to be. I'm in Mexico right now, and my mind is a little slow because I just woke up from a little nap. But I will try to be lucid, at least that I'll say. And I'll begin by appreciating all of you, the work that you do, the support you give to people in our country and outside of our country. And tell you that from my personal perspective, we need you more than you probably realize in terms of closing the gap in healthcare in this country. And that the kind of leadership that I'm hoping to get from you is not just what you can do as a doctor or a surgeon, but what you can do as a leader in your country to advocate for a better healthcare system that will be equitable for all Canadians in our lifetime. So, but let me begin by saying to you that I was born in a small community called Grand Rapids, Mississippi in my own language, which just means Grand Rapids, in 1946. And my exposure to the settler society really didn't happen until I was about maybe 10 or 12 years old. I forget the exact time I went to a hospital in Nepal. So my contact with any settler institution, and in particular with the hospital, only occurred because of an accident. So where I am from, we used to have a rapids called the Grand Rapids. It doesn't exist anymore. It was silenced by hydro development. So a lot of our land was in fact underwater now on the west side of our territory. And our neighboring communities, which was our cousin Cree communities, called Chimahoin, Moose Lake, and Upasqua Cree Nation, they all were impacted by this hydro development. And the hydro project was right within our community, within a mile of where I was born and raised. So you can imagine the impact that had on with respect to the continuation of a way of life that had sustained our community for, I'll say, centuries. A life that was based on fishing, hunting and trapping, and so on, like gathering fruits, natural fruits that the land gave us. And all that has been impacted by a flooding, a man-made flood to create electrical power, primarily for the people living in urban centers and south of our community called Grand Rapids. In fact, the destruction of our land was so deep, so strong, that we still feel the trauma of that in our community called Grand Rapids. And my cousin community called Chimahoin is underwater. Their reserve is underwater, most of it, the original reserve, and their gravesite is underwater. So that was my exposure to the settlers' power. Okay, so that's had a big impact on me. And you wonder why anyone would do that to anybody. But I am not surprised now on how people can be motivated for something called the economy, and the quality of life that they perceive as a natural place for them, but not necessarily for anybody else. So I have noticed this great divide as early as my teenage years, I guess. And when I went to the Paul, it was because I had stepped on a rusty nail and my foot got infected and I was in danger of losing my foot. So I was flown to the Paul. Now, this is pretty much what a lot of First Nations people in Northern Ontario experience when there's no roads to their community, is that their access to the hospital is by plane. And in those communities where there is road access to a hospital nearby them, their access to the hospital is by road. The reason for that is because there are no hospitals on reservations. Maybe with a few very rare exceptions like Norway House and Moose Factory, which is not a reserve, but it's a community close to a reserve in James Bay area. What I'm grateful about is that because of Western medicine and because of doctors in the hospital in Nepal, they were able to save my foot. So I appreciate the advances in science. I'm not one who will dismiss the importance of knowledge that the settler has. What I don't like about that is not that you have the knowledge and that capacity. What I dislike is the inequity of it, the absence of that in Indigenous communities. So most of my life has been about this idea of trying to create a balance between my people that I represented and the Canadian society by focusing on something called the Constitution of the country. It's actually based on a very simple idea, but I don't know for sure if it would work. I hope it would. And it's called the rule of law. Now, you've heard a lot of that lately because of the truckers' protest across the country. But the rule of law I'm talking about is not just about the enforcement of the settlers' laws, but it's also the recognition and the enforcement of Indigenous laws. And it's also about respecting and enforcing the treaty and Aboriginal rights of Indigenous people in Canada, including their right to self-determination. In other words, to have jurisdiction over their people, over their territory, like their lands and their resources and their waters, and to have jurisdiction over subject matters like education and health and so forth. Jurisdictions that are taken for granted by the settlers' democracy for itself, but are not necessarily seen as necessary for Indigenous people in Canada. So my life has been this idea that if the white man really is about the rule of law, why don't we change their constitution if we can to recognize our place in our own country, a place where we can develop side by each and progress together by having amendments to the Constitution that recognizes my people's right to self-determination, their jurisdiction over the things I just talked about, as well as sharing wealth that comes from their Indigenous lands that is not happening at the present time. That is not to say that I don't recognize the things that the country has done with respect to contribution agreements like funding for healthcare and support for health services that are now happening. Those are important contributions of the settler to our well-being as a people. But it is not an equitable share of the wealth that is generated from our traditional lands. So my idea was that, why don't we try to change the Constitution then to have Canada recognize our right to govern ourselves over our lands and our territories, but also to have a constitutional mandate for sharing in a similar manner that, say, Canada now shares its wealth with provinces through taxation and transfer payments and stuff like that. And my approach was that if it's enshrined in the Constitution, and if they really believe in the rule of law, then it'll be easier for us to have equity in Canada, because it'll be part of the rule of law of the country. Yeah, and so I was involved in different struggles to accomplish that. And Homer knows a little bit about my history, about how we try to wake up the country to the fact that they don't own everything, but also that they're not just the founding nations of this great land. We were here before the English and the French ever thought about coming here. Yet they created a federal system of government, dividing powers amongst themselves, even at the time when they have yet to make treaties with us. What a presumption of arrogance, I thought, growing up, that they would show up in our traditional lands and carve up the territory, including the powers to exercise jurisdiction, and then impose a country on our people without the benefit of negotiating together what that country should look like and how we could travel together in this part of the world, you know, the North American continent. We were successful in, I think, defeating what is called the Meech Lake Accord, which was another effort by the settler to appease Quebec, rearrange a little bit about the power, particularly with respect to immigration and stuff like that, and recognize the province as a distinct society, and convening all these constitutional discussions with the objective of having an amendment in the supreme law of this country to give Quebec that distinction as a distinct people, distinct society, while ignoring completely our presence as a people. And I'm talking about the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations people. So I think that might have been the first time in recent memory where all Indigenous peoples collaborated to fight back the idea of the two founding nations, the French and the English. In the words of John Amagalik, who was one of the Inuit leaders during the discussions over Meech Lake, he said at one of the press conferences that we had, if Quebec is a distinct society, what are we? Chopped liver? It was, I think, an important statement. And I'll never forget that because it was so powerful and so clear in getting the message out. We're a distinct people too, but you're completely ignoring our place in this country. Now, why am I spending so much time on this? This idea of the rule of law and this idea of the federation without recognition of our self-determination. It's part of our history of that resulted in our people losing their power, their authority. Even with respect to things like treaty rights to food, to hunting and fishing, the various governments across Canada, and particularly the prairie provinces, starting enacting legislation pursuant to their authority under the British North America Act to prohibit our people from fishing and hunting, which was in fact promised by treaty. So they were violating a promise that was, in our opinion, something that was considered very sacred. When I was a lawyer, for instance, I represented one of my elders from my community. And at that time, the law was such that he had no defense. He had gone hunting to feed his dogs. And don't forget, when I was born in 1946, our people are still using dog teams for the mode of transportation. And we didn't have cars at that time, or trucks, or skidoos. So animals were important. Particularly dogs were important as a means of transportation for us. So the incident I'm talking about happened, of course, later on in 1980s. But by that time, of course, we had a highway to Grand Rapids, and the mode of transportation had changed. But nonetheless, he still had his dogs, and he still had to feed them. But the law didn't allow that. But he had a treaty right to do that. So that's the other thing that I noticed that I'm going to share with you is how much power there is in law. As you can see for the Emergencies Act that was announced a few days ago or a couple of days ago, it highlights this idea that people should respect the law. But how can you respect a law that discriminates against you? In our case, where a treaty is being violated by the laws that the province is making. My thought was, we have a right to fight that law. We have a right to fight back on that law that violates a sacred and solemn agreement that was made between Queen Victoria and our people back home in Grand Rapids and so on. All the treaties 1 to 11. Yeah, I guess I'm rambling a bit, and I could be talking more about health conditions and all that, but you are aware of them. What I'm trying to convey to you is this, that a lot of that is because of the imbalance in terms of power that's exercised in this country, and because the imbalance in terms of wealth that is distributed in this country, not evenly and not equally. I've often said, to make that point, when I was chief at home in Grand Rapids, that but for poverty, we would have our own health centers, our own cultural centers, our own infrastructure for water and sewer. We would not be paupers on our own land, and we would not be dependent upon a province that's reluctant to help us, or on a federal government that does help us, but not enough to make a big difference in terms of equal opportunity for our young people in education and so on. So the power imbalance and the poverty of our people, these are the main obstacles right now. Those are the obstacles that I saw growing up, and most of my life has been about trying to rectify that. But how do you rectify that when you're dealing with politicians and leaders of the country, or like provinces and the federal government, who can't even agree amongst themselves how to run their provinces or their country because they divided themselves into parties, and they never speak with the same tongue. And you never know, as an Indigenous person or a leader, what a change the government's going to do, whether it's going to advance your cause or set it back another decade or so. And we've been victimized by the party system as well. That is the basis of democracy in this country. Mina. So I will speak a little in my own language. I don't want to teach you anything about speaking my language. Maga, it's important that our people retain their own language, their own culture, their own belief system. And that too has been taken away from us in the past 150 years, in particular by missionization and Christianity, as well as by the residential school system. which I think has been probably the most horrendous instrument of assimilation. It would be equivalent to me becoming the big boss in the country and removing all your children from you and forcing them to speak my language. And you have nothing to say about it. You have no way of fighting back because you're powerless. That you're poor, and you're not familiar with the country in terms of, you're not familiar with me, let's say, in terms of my ways, and I prohibit you from hiring lawyers to fight for your rights, and I make a law against your spirituality, which is all what happened in this country. And I make a law as well as giving the right to the churches and the various denominations to run residential schools for the country, so that they can do two things. One, promote their own brand of Christianity while removing our distinct identity and our languages from us. I've often wondered, like, how can we survive all that and emerge at a different place, in a better place? Which is why I focused on this idea that since Canadians, by and large, support the rule of law, and they're very obedient to that, why not use their supreme law, their own constitution, to tell them to respect my people, to respect our rights to land and resources, to our own self-determination, and also to tell them to honor the treaties that were made on behalf of Canada so long ago, over a century ago. That's where I came in as a national chief, and then I dealt with something called the Charlottetown Accord. You may want to read that. That was the effort. But the Charlottetown Accord did result in a political agreement that all the provinces agreed to, and the federal government, that would have recognized things like an obligation to honor the treaties, as well as the right of self-determination, or the right of self-government, as we called it then, and the commitment to keep talking about how wealth will be shared, so that our people with their governments can then turn their attention to improving the quality of life of their citizens, because they will have the wealth to support that, so that they wouldn't have to have boiling water advisories in order to have drinking water. And that so that they could have in their own communities paramedic services, or they could have doctors and nurses, their own people, as doctors and nurses. And they would also have all these fire protection capacity, not just fire equipment, but trained firefighters, so that people wouldn't die because of lack of that in their communities, as it is right now. So the struggle is not just about how you as a doctor can come to, say, Piganjigam and help bring your knowledge and capacity and help the people there with their health conditions. It's more than that. Because when you leave, the condition will still be there, because it's a structural problem. It's not just an individual patient's issue. Now, I value doctors. I do because I have a heart condition called AFib. And in my community, I can't rely on just traditional medicine for that. I respect our own knowledge of medicines and all that. But there are certain things that are beyond our capacity. And why we are now dependent upon people like yourselves who are doctors and nurses to deal with the diabetes that's rampant, the cancer that is growing, the respiratory diseases that are plaguing our young populations. It's not a happy place right now, what I'm saying. But imagine with me what I'm trying to say to you. But for the lack of power, and but for the poverty, and now but for racism, if it wasn't for these obstacles, we'd be in a very different place today. Very different place. Because as you can see from the COVID experience, that our leaders are very wise. And but for our leaders, the impact of COVID would be more severe in our communities. There would be more deaths than actually what happened. The only thing we didn't have is our own source revenue, our own wealth to respond to COVID. So we're totally dependent upon the other governments for providing the funding and the materials that we needed for education, but also for treatment. Like we didn't even have a place because of overcrowding in our communities where we could self-isolate if we had COVID in our community. But that can change. That could have been different if everything that I said was wrong with this country was not wrong with this country. It would have been very different. You know, we get very, very tired of complaining. And I myself, was led nationally, but also led regionally, but also led at the local level. I found it very demeaning as a leader of my people to always be in the position of begging for something. I'm sure you can see that in my face, and maybe you can hear it in my voice. But the point I'm making is this, that it doesn't have to be that way. That there's still an opportunity for this country to become maybe great in spite of itself, I don't know, but better than itself for sure. That we can perfect it. We can make it better for everybody. And that we just need the law to change, people's minds to change and all that, and for the resources to be identified so that our people can march themselves out of poverty and into a place where they have water and sewer that they need for their communities, the facilities that they need for quality of life, all that are taken for granted, even in rural small white communities. The story that I like to say sometimes to people to highlight the inequity is that when I was chief at home, I would drive from Grand Rapids to Winnipeg along Highway 6. We had a nursing station on the provincial side. The province had a nursing station in Grand Rapids. And then I would travel to Winnipeg, and I would see two hospitals in small white towns, not any bigger than Grand Rapids. And paramedic services available to these white rural villages and towns that are not available in my community. And I see that inequity as I'm traveling. And then when I negotiated a new health facility, which I was successful doing for my community, I negotiated joint funding between the federal government and the province of Manitoba. The first issue I had to deal with was this idea that the province doesn't, at least at that time, didn't like supporting any infrastructure development on reserves, that they saw that as a federal obligation and federal responsibility. So I had to deal with that by challenging a human rights case against the province of Manitoba. And then once that was resolved, we were not allowed to build a facility, just one facility. We had to divide the provincial money from the federal money and create two buildings, one with federal money and one with federal money. How crazy is that? And you swallow those things. As a leader, you say, okay, it's better than nothing. So you swallow your principles all the time, just to make some progress. We have a nice healthcare center at home now because of it. But why put my community through that torture just to get a facility that is essential? And it's not even comparable to those white towns that I'm talking about, that I see with hospitals in Nepal, on the west side, or Ashwin, Manitoba, before even arriving in Winnipeg. Yeah, that's my story. That's my story as an individual. But my story is nothing compared to the inequities, as you're going to see once you start working in the northern communities. When you go to places like Sandy Lake or Piganjigam or say Fort Severn or any of those communities, you'll know what inequity is. You will see it in the housing conditions. You'll see it in the road conditions. You'll see it in the condition of the infrastructure or the absence of it. You'll see it in the level of unemployment and in the communities. You'll see it in the level of success at the high school system or the elementary school system. You'll see it throughout every part of our lives. And when you look at that, if anything, don't look at it like a redneck would and say the Indians are to blame for themselves, for their own stupidity and their own laziness and all that stuff. You know, don't look at it from the eyes of a racist. These are not because of the culture that we have. These conditions are not there because of the culture that we have. The human condition that we have right now is based on the impact of colonialism in terms of our ability to fend for ourselves. I think I've said enough. Maybe I'll stop there, and people have questions. I'll try to answer as honestly as I can.
Well, thank you, Mr. Megrady. That was really powerful. And, you know, as I've learned what you've accomplished and your leadership and your advocacy, and we have all been educated to some extent about our history. And I would say as I become educated, I'm somewhat ashamed by what Canadians have done. I'll just say that outright. And I think that all of us feel passionate about trying to change the future. And I want to thank you for sharing those words with us. We're going to carry on with the rest of the symposium, and then we'll have a panel for those questions that you mentioned. I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity for discussion. So thank you for your time, and please hang in there if you can. I next want to introduce Dr. Rajiv Singhal, who is the Chief of Surgery at Michael Garron and a major contributor to our global surgical community here in Toronto. And he'll introduce our next speakers. Dr. Singhal.
Oh, thank you, Avery. So so first of all, just thank you for everybody for joining. I think this important annual event that we have. Thank you specifically to Joanna Giddens for all the hard work that she does to put this together every single year. So I'm personally very grateful for it. And you know, as I listen to Mr. Megrady, I think the piece around what we can do as advocates just to sort of be better citizens and bridge that gap between our tendencies as human beings to separate ourselves from others and recognize our distinctions and what we can do to work together. I think is the path that hopefully we can work towards building. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Homer Tian. He is a general surgeon and a trauma surgeon at Sunnybrook. He is the CEO of Orange, and he was responsible for the organization of Ontario's successful vaccination program in 32 remote Indigenous communities, Operation Remote Immunity. And after the successful completion of that, as I think most of us here know, he was appointed chair of Ontario's COVID vaccine distribution task force last year, and we're very grateful for that. And so I will leave it to Dr. Tian. He's going to talk about operational planning process and Ontario's vaccination program in remote Indigenous communities. It's all yours, Homer.
Sorry, have to get off mute. Thanks very much. And thanks to Dr. Nathans and Dr. Ruckett for the invitation, and Joanna, and really thanks to Ovid for advice and mentorship, I think, over the years. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Operation Remote Immunity, and really just, I think what we've heard is Operation Remote Immunity was our mission that offered residents 18 plus of 32 remote Indigenous communities their full immunization with the Moderna vaccine. And it's important that we recognize this was co-developed and co-led by Indigenous leadership. We were the external lead, but Indigenous leadership was of absolute critical importance to the rollout and success of this. So we were announced as the lead on December 21st, 2020, and we launched on February the 1st and completed our second doses by April 9th, 2021. So at the end of this presentation, I just want to talk a bit about leadership and management and talk about how good management principles can really get things done. But this, with good management, you have to respect Indigenous autonomy and leadership while managing a crisis. And that was, I think, my learning out of this mission. And I'd just like to share some of, I guess, my observations about that. I think there's some leadership skills for engaging and obtaining support of key stakeholders. And hopefully these leadership practices might be relevant to leading in emergency situations throughout the world that you may encounter. So I think we've all seen this. the idea that a leader inspires and that a manager's the sort of that bossy person that's giving orders. And I think we all aspire to be that leader who inspires and really motivates his team. But I'll offer a slightly different view, and a bit of a who said this: we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. So who said that? Band of brothers, Homer Simpson, Abraham Lincoln, or King Henry V? And I won't make you put up your hands. I think we all know that it's Henry V at his St. Crispin Day speech at the Battle of Agincourt. And I think, people will in popular culture say that it's really that speech that galvanized the English to defeat a French force 3 times the size of that English force. But really, if you look at what historians say, it was really good planning, good strategy, good tactics that carried the day. So there might have been inspiration, but you can't do important things without good planning. And so really, I think I'm just going to speak a bit about some of the management processes for ORI and how we got important things done. So as you might know, I used to be in the military, and they had this thing called battle procedure. And I won't go through it all, but really, the things that they stressed about is that this importance of reconnaissance. So try to find out what's going on as soon as you can, and the idea of doing concurrent activity. So even before you're told that you're responsible for something, you might have a heads up, what they call in the military a warning order. And during that time, before you get your full set of orders, you really need to do as much as you can, because in a crisis, sometimes time is a limitation. And so for me, the warning order came on December 4th, 2020, and sort of out of the blue. And I kid you not, I had no idea this was coming. I think Minister Elliott called out of the blue and said, "Do you want to be on the vaccine task force?" And to me, I thought that was a little bizarre, given that I'm a trauma surgeon, a general surgeon. Like, what do I know about a vaccine? And so, it's a hard thing to say no to, but I sort of thought, well, it must be related, obviously, to my work at Orange. And so I started thinking, well, if it's about the remote north, what are things that we can do to get ready? And so we started procuring -70 fridges. We started looking at transport cubes. We started looking at, if we had to go, which aircraft are we going to go with? And talking to the Ministry of Natural Resources and our other contracts about what airplanes can we deploy if we had to go north, and sort of mapping all of these things out. Part of the thing that you do after your warning orders, you do a map check. So let's familiarize ourselves with the geography. Obviously in Orange, we work in that area anyway, but to give you an idea of some of the territory, the brown area is the area that's represented by Anishinaabe-Aski Nation. It's over 40 communities, and of these, there are a bunch of fly-in communities that are only accessible by air. And so there was a sense that that perhaps we would be asked to participate in this. And when you look at the geography, Fort Severn might be 800 kilometers from Thunder Bay. So these are large distances with very few people in each of the communities. And the geography is such that it's difficult weather and gravel runways with no de-icing facilities. So from a logistical point of view, there were certainly going to be some challenges to this. And then in terms of a map check, where are we? So we have bases at Orange in Sioux Lookout, Thunder Bay, Timmins, and Moosonee. And so obviously, when you think about staging and logistics, you have to think about where can you stage your forward operating bases. And then you look at where's the vaccine going to be stored, and it was stored in a single facility in Mississauga, a single point of distribution. And so this was just a sense of how we might organize these things. And we started looking at how would we organize our bases into forward operating bases. And then in terms of a time check, this was now sort of early December, but what we knew were there were certain timetables that as you'll hear later, we thought we were going to need to make sure all of our vaccinators were doubly vaccinated. So that would impose an immediate 4-week delay at a minimum to make sure that those people were vaccinated. And then we had to provide first and second doses. And so that would impose a delay if it were Moderna between when we could start first doses versus second doses. And we were told by Indigenous leadership we needed to get this done by April because the communities were at risk for evacuation for spring flooding. So we sort of mapped out our time frame based on some of these types of considerations early on to think if we had to go, this is what it might look like. So we got the go-ahead on December 20th. It wasn't that long ago. We started this thing called the operational planning process. So there's a lot of stuff that's like, what is happening? Get your people together. Do I understand what success looks like? And I'll talk a bit about that just to sort of give everyone a sense of where we're at. But the most important thing, I think, in terms of respecting Indigenous leadership and autonomy are, you have to think, what are the factors, critical requirements, and constraints that will affect our solutions? And in this case, it's really, what does Indigenous leadership think is important? And then you really need to say that that's sort of a line in the sand. I'm going to respect that, and we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that those are fulfilled in our planning, and then go from there. So that step, I think I'll stress right now, is critical in the planning process. So what's happening? So at this time in December, First Nations were prioritized in the phase 1 of the vaccine rollout with the other high-risk groups. And this was because of difficulty in evacuating from the communities and lack of infrastructure that Mr. Megrady mentioned that makes isolation difficult. We knew that the remote flying communities is difficult geography for us to get it into, and we were identified as the lead agency on December 20th, and NAN was the co-lead. So we got our HQ staff, and I mean, so this is really a standard org chart, but really, so I was the op leader, but I had a very close relationship with the Grand Chief of NAN, Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler. I had a chief of staff, and so this is what we mobilized very quickly. We had HR to organize contracts. We had med operations logistics for our hubs, for medical stores, for scheduling. We had aviation operations. We had our med advisor to do things like med records and med delegation. We had a whole host of partners, from Red Cross to the medical schools to First Nations Inuit Health Branch in the federal side. We had liaisons with the military. We had Ministry of Health. And so we had to set up a rhythm of very frequent meetings, what they call a battle rhythm of, once a day meetings, 5 times a week at the beginning, to make sure we got everyone on the same page. It's important to define what success looks like, because as you know, these days, people don't always tell you what success is. You end up having to figure out what you can get done and then making sure everyone is okay with that. And so we decided with NAN which were the 32 communities to be included. And we sensitized that with the local Indigenous leadership to make sure everyone was okay. We needed to develop vaccine confidence and to try to get a vaccination rate of 80% or higher. And in the background of this, for flu vaccinations, the vaccination rate is about 8%. And so we knew there was substantial vaccine hesitancy in these communities. And we needed to come up with a schedule that all 32 stakeholders agreed on. And we needed to be done by mid-April before the communities were evacuated for spring flooding. And so I think this is the key step in terms of respecting Indigenous autonomy and working with Indigenous leadership. It's really asking them, what are your guiding statements and principles? What are the things that you must have in this mission, and really abiding by it? And so it might be a little hard to see. So one of the things is that all of our vaccine teams had to be doubly vaccinated. We had to look at, I won't go through them all, but I'll talk about some of the more important ones. We had to have translation. We had to have home service. Teams had to be competent in their areas. We needed to work very closely with the community. So there had to be a full-on community partner. and we don't stress the resources of the community. This was a big one. I think Mr. Megrady mentioned that there's very little housing, food is difficult. And so one of the conditions that we were asked to think about was not to stay in community. That means going in and going out on a daily basis so that we didn't stress the resources of the community. And so then we consider these as must-haves, must-dos. And so that means when we broke it down, we needed to have agreement with Indigenous leadership about the sequence of the communities. We needed to have community ownership and community coordination. We needed to have respect for Indigenous culture. So that meant consents in the language, cultural sensitivity training. We needed qualified HHR that were doubly vaccinated. If you remember at that time, very few people were vaccinated. And so that was going to be a challenge. And we needed to have vaccine confidence in the communities and not stay in the communities. So when we started with this, these were sort of the immutables that we had to work with, and we had very little time to try to get these accomplished. So we did this, I guess, by having Indigenous leadership agree on the sequencing principles. So we had a lot of meetings about what should the principles be by which we sequence the communities. So if they could start on their own resources, we would support it. Obviously, we're going to do just the fly-in communities, not the one with road access. We divided the area into different tribal councils, and we would select equitably from each region to start. And we would focus on remoteness. So the further out you are, the earlier we would start, and the smaller population, the earlier we would start. And then there were special things like if they were at threat for evacuation for forest fires or for flooding, we would give them priority. And one of the reasons larger communities were prioritized at the end was because we knew we would need much more HHR resources than that we would have at the beginning. So these were the principles we took to Indigenous leadership, and we came up with a proposal, and they agreed to it. And then there was negotiation. So Niskandaga, for example, is a community that wasn't prioritized at the top, but then leadership said we'd like them to go first because they've had a boil water advisory. This, if you recall, that their community was evacuated because they had petroleum products in their water and they'd just gotten back. And so everyone had asked, let's do Niskandaga first. And so that was an easy decision. And so we listened to them when we came up with our proposal for sequencing and for the order. Community ownership was a big one. Obviously, we're flying in for a short period of time. We needed a lot of work in the community done. And so we needed a community coordinator. This becomes difficult because one of the things about, I guess, systemic racism is the question comes up as, well, the people coming in are getting paid. So we need to come up with pay for the community coordinator, which makes perfect sense to me. But as you know, there's a lot of jurisdictional ambiguity in terms of who pays for what on reserves. And so we would have to negotiate. We negotiated with the First Nations Inuit Health Branch about trying to get a package for the community coordinator, the drivers, and so forth. And so that was something that was of absolute importance. And we really had to say that if we couldn't get it, the mission wasn't going to go. That was one of those must-haves. We had to liaise with the Canadian Armed Forces to get to activate the Canadian Rangers in their communities to help with driving and other tasks. So this was a key part of it. And it was really about Indigenous participation at the grassroots level. We had translated consents. It's actually much more difficult than you'd think to get something translated into Ojibwe, Cree, and Oji Cree. And so it really took us about 2 months to get this done. And so the consents were coming out just as we were about to launch for ORI. Oops. Cultural sensitivity training. I think Danielle and I saw Dr. Brenneman on here. They both had to go through Indigenous cultural competency training. We all did, and it's certainly eye-opening. It's something that I certainly went through and appreciated. And I think the feedback that I heard from the surgeons that have gone forward was that it was very eye-opening as well. And then, so in terms of the HHR, so we had a general design that was sort of military in style, that you'd have a team lead whose job was to come up with the local plan with the community coordinator. We would have a second in command who was responsible for communications, administration, supplies. We had our vaccinators and we had our administrative folk. And this was the basic unit, but we could have 2 or 3 teams in one community. The deployment cycle was based on a week. This is something that we did in the military, but it was really a 10-month cycle. But the idea was that if your deployment day was D-Day, you would work backwards. You'd have arrival, training, preparation, operational briefings, and then you would launch on your op. So in this case, it was a 7-day cycle with 2 days before, 5 days of operations, and then a backup weather day. And then you would start your next cycle for the following week. And so this was a cycle that we adopted, which is pretty standard in any type of deployment. Obviously, it's just the amount of time that you decide that you want to give to each part. HHR was a major issue, and I think some of you had heard me come on different calls to sort of plead for our case for why some of you might join, and some of you we're very grateful that there was such a great turnout. So when you look at our time frame, Orange has about 200 paramedics all across the province, but we're responsible for 24/7 staffing for 8 helicopters, 4 fixed-wing aircraft, and 2 land ambulances. And so out of those 200, we had to figure out how are we going to get Operation Remote Immunity done. And it doesn't take a math genius to realize that's not enough people. So we were going to have to recruit. And so from December 21st, when we got the lead and we started on our day 1, we started going through who could we go to. We went to all EMS organizations. We went to Orange for overtime people. We went to HR companies like Calian and Medivy. We went to the Red Cross. We had to activate the Red Cross through the provincial government and develop contracts for that. And then we started counting and thought, whoa, we don't have enough people. We started going to the med schools. We went to NOSM, Queen's, U of T. And then we realized we still don't have enough. But as I realized that, more and more of my colleagues were getting vaccinated, that I might put out a plea through Dr. Rutka at Department of Surgery. I was very grateful for the immediate response that we had. And it was sort of an ad hoc, hey, we're now in mid-January, we need to go on February 1st. Who's interested in going? And I was very grateful with the huge response that we had from friends and colleagues all across the Department of Surgery. And then so our plan was to have 6 teams of 6 for weeks 1 and week 2. And as we got more people, we would get more teams going. And so our total, when I talk about partners and stakeholders, it was a very large multidisciplinary team. We had the different ministries, so Health, Solicitor General, MNRF, and Indigenous Affairs. NAN was obviously the co-lead. The feds were Indigenous Services, Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority, WAHA, and the med schools. It was really a very large team that we met, and people contributed resources and their efforts and their knowledge. So the next thing was about vaccine hesitancy. Lots of questions about that, right? From a history of medical experimentation, residential schools, a huge mistrust of the medical system and the governments. And so we had a very aggressive, our plan was to talk to every level of leadership and multiple times. And so we started scheduling them based on the sequence. And you can just see, every day there was a community with questions, larger meetings with the political leadership. And it was just a schedule of community outreach, answering questions and concerns. Lots, and all obviously all on Teams or Zoom, but it really helped us get a lot done virtually. And we had consistent messaging through social media. I'll sort of get through this quickly because I know we're a little short on time. Multimedia outreach. And so we made sure that the messages from all Indigenous organizations were the same. So Anishinaabe, Aski Nation, Sioux Lookout, Waha, they all had the same information. And we had opinion leaders. This is the chief from Niskandaga, really showing that he was out there not afraid of getting the vaccine and speaking up as to why his community members he thought should be getting the vaccine. And then day-to-day is, you should never forget the day-to-day operations. We had a tactical operations center on a daily basis that looked at, did the airplane show up? Did they have fuel? Were there any issues? And we had our logistical hubs where, supplies were ordered, vaccines were ordered, and they had to make sure that they were delivered on a regular basis with PPE and so forth. And so it was sort of a full-on logistical operation as well. And so the last thing I want to talk about is, some of the leadership skills. So we talked a lot about management and operational planning, but inspiring. So one of the things that's important to remember is this is a co-led mission. So any success is really Indigenous success. And so I think our philosophy was we should be showcasing the efforts of the Indigenous people on the ground, the leadership in it. It is not a success of the government or of Orange. And really, we wanted to showcase grassroots leadership. And so I think what we saw was that people really took to sort of talking about their experiences and really feeling part of ORI. And I think in terms of any inspiration, it's that if we think about success, it's something that we all succeed. And so then it should be everyone who should be taking credit for it and not just one or two people. And so really, I guess my last slide is lessons learned. I think operational planning is critical. So even though we talk about inspiring leadership, you can't ignore the importance of operational planning and the nitty-gritty of the logistics and tactical operations. For, I guess, working in the North, Indigenous leadership and autonomy must be respected, even if we're acting as the operational lead. And we can do this by having major decisions and principles brought early for discussion and agreement, frequent touch points and discussion with Indigenous leadership, truly respecting their guiding principles. I think the easiest thing for us to say is when Indigenous leadership gives us a guiding principle, we say that's too difficult or that's too hard or that's too expensive. But if we truly believe they are co-leading and they're important, I think it behooves us to really treat those as a line in the sand that we have to respect. And then if there is any disagreement, openly discuss and resolve in a transparent fashion. And lastly, it is a joint endeavor, so all successes should be celebrated as a joint success. So that's all I had. Thanks for asking me to speak today.
Well, that's terrific, Homer. Thank you very much. Just to highlight the tremendous amount of process that needs to be done, and some of the sensitivities, as you said, that need to be thought about to make that successful. So thank you for that. I suspect there'll be some questions during the panel. So Avery, that's correct, right? Everyone will wait for that part. So we'll introduce our next speaker. It gives me pleasure. I've not actually met Dr. Bishop, but Dr. Daniel Bishop is a surgical oncologist at Mount Sinai. I might have been on a couple of calls with her and Princess Margaret Hospital, and is an assistant professor in our Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto. Her clinical interests include the treatment of peritoneal malignancies, GI surgery, including colorectal, appendix, small bowel cancers, and acute care general surgery. Academic interests are in medical education, including curriculum development, culture change in surgery, and ensuring safe learning spaces for all. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bishop, who's going to speak beyond Operation Remote Readiness, remote immunity, working towards culturally safe surgical care. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my slides. Can you guys see them? Excellent. So I want to thank Avery Nathans, Jim Rutka, and Joanna Giddens for inviting me to speak today. I was very fortunate to participate in Operation Remote Immunity as a vaccinator. And so I'm going to speak about my experience participating in Operation Remote Immunity, as well as sort of what I've been working on since then in terms of working towards culturally safe surgical care in Toronto. So as Homer has already sort of explained, Operation Remote Immunity was really a collaborative effort between Orange, the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, as well as multiple other stakeholders, where COVID vaccines were administered in 32, I guess, remote fly-in communities in Northern Ontario. Vaccines were free and were available to all community members who were eligible for vaccination. And so I initially sort of responded to the Department of Surgery call out for looking for vaccinators. I was lucky enough that I'd had my second dose in time, and very lucky to have been selected to participate. I participated in the first week of the operation, which was February 1st to 5th. And was assigned to a team that was based out of Thunder Bay to go to Slate Falls First Nation to vaccinate. And so there was quite a bit of training prior to going. I would say the highlight for me was really the SANYAS Anti-Racism Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program. The QR code is there. If you haven't done this, I would highly recommend that everyone do this. I think that it's really sort of behooves us as Canadians to know about the history of colonization in Canada, residential schools, and how that's impacted the health of Indigenous people in Canada. I found the training very impactful. It also is accredited for Section 3 MOC credits. And so would really, really, really urge you to do this if you haven't already. I found it very impactful. There was additional training to participate in sort of how to dress for austere winter conditions, how to operate the satellite phone if the plane crashes, and sort of other things prior to going. And so this is a map of the fly-in communities in Ontario. So my team was based in Thunder Bay, and we flew sort of every day back and forth to Slate Falls First Nation, which is an Ojibwe community. Population's about 200 and is in Treaty 9 territory. And so sort of every morning we would get up, pack our minivan, go to the airport, load the plane, and take off to Slate Falls. This is the team that I was with. So it was myself, a physician from Sunnybrook, as well as an Indigenous nurse and members of Orange. And then on the right, you can see our pilots who were part of the Ministry of Natural Resources. And basically, yeah, this is the plane. So we have our precious cargo secured with a seatbelt in the Credo Cube, which was monitored for temperature, and at the front of the plane is all the survival gear, as well as the supplies for vaccinating. There was definitely like a lot of, like, we sort of brought everything in and out every day. We took our Sharps containers there and back, and definitely there was a lot of stuff that we had to bring back and forth every day. And then this is sort of the airport in Slate Falls, as well as this is the school on the right, which was where our vaccination clinic was running. We ran our vaccination clinic out of the preschool, which at that point was closed for COVID, to not sort of disrupt the usual activities. Here, sort of you can see Slate Falls was a smaller community, and it was towards the start of the operation. So over the week, we did, I think, 119 doses. So it wasn't that many doses that we were doing every day, but I think it was important sort of to start out slow. I think this was the first week. There was some hesitancy for sure initially in terms of people coming in. There were sort of several people in the first day or two who came in to talk about the vaccine, but they weren't really sure and came back later in the week to get vaccinated. And over the week, we really sort of were able to vaccinate the majority of the community. Here's some photos. This is a post from Alvin Fiddler, who was the chief of NAN at the time. The first person vaccinated in our clinic was Chief Lorraine Crane, who is the chief in Slate Falls First Nation, and Nellie Beardy, who is the Indigenous nurse on our team, vaccinated her. And I think that really set the stage for the rest of the community to come in and get vaccinated. There was a lot of outreach over Facebook within the community while we were there, and a lot of the leadership of the community sort of really was important in terms of over the week getting everyone out and getting everyone vaccinated. The clinic, sort of as Homer described, was really run by the community partners. They sort of scheduled people in. They they picked up community members to bring them to their vaccination appointments, drove them home afterwards. They made snacks for the community members after they got vaccinated. They translated as needed. And they really led the clinics. And it was really a privilege to be a part of it. We also did home visits for community members who weren't able to come to our vaccine clinic. And so this is our big team that we had that sort of ran the vaccination clinic in the week that I was there in Slate Falls. In the school at our vaccine clinic, they had these posters up, which are the 7 sacred grandfather teachings. And I really saw all of these qualities on display during my week in the community. I sort of looked at my time there as like I was a guest in their community while I was there, and felt very privileged to be able to be there. And I really tried to listen and learn from all the community members. And for me, it was a really profound learning experience. I really reflected upon the effects of colonization, as well as racism on Indigenous people in Canada. And it was really an impactful experience. It's an experience I'm going to remember for the rest of my career. And I'm very sort of thankful that I was able to participate. I think sort of in thinking about why Operation Remote Immunity was important, Saul Mamakwa, who's the MPP for Queetnong, said in a private or in a member statement in the House of Commons in March 2020, there was vaccine hesitancy in some First Nations because First Nations people have never been at the front of the line when it comes to services like healthcare. We're always at the back of the line because most of our communities don't have access to full-time doctors, clinics, pharmacies, or even clean running water. People were unsure that the vaccine was safe and that it must be taken to protect the health of our families, our languages, and our way of life. And I think he sort of really, for me, sort of highlighted why this was so important. And why this was so important to do as sort of phase 1 of the vaccine rollout. And so after my experience, I got home and I read a lot in terms of, I read the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The Royal College has a fantastic Indigenous health primer that I would recommend you read. I read several books by Indigenous authors and try to reflect on sort of ways that I can be a better ally and promote Indigenous health. And for me, the next steps were, I guess, number one, trying to be a better advocate, an ally, and an anti-racist in my own academic surgical practice. Number two, sort of as a result of participation in Operation Remote Immunity, myself, Barbara Haas, and Gaia Naganathan, who's a general surgery resident, organized and co-led a symposium at our General Surgery Annual Assembly of General Surgeons on improving access to surgical care for Indigenous patients and communities. And then the third thing that I'm working on now is a cultural safety curriculum for surgical residents. And so the symposium we put together was in May 2021. We were very lucky to have Tanya Talaga, who's the author of Seven Fallen Feathers, Indigenous storyteller, speak. I think probably several people who were here on the call were there as well as Alvin Fiddler, who at the time was the Grand Chief of NAN, and Lisa Richardson, Jason Pennington, Kathy McLeod Beaver, Diane Longboat, and Jack Langer. And we spoke about Operation Remote Immunity, but we also sort of more on a bigger scale spoke about disparities in access to healthcare and sort of tangible actions we can take to improve the health system for everyone. I think for many in the Department of General Surgery, it was an eye-opening symposium. And at the towards the end of the symposium, Lisa Richardson really challenged us to do something tangible to move forward, to advocate for Indigenous health. And so myself, Carol Swallow, and Erin Kennedy sort of spoke about different things we could do and came up with the General Surgery Chairs Challenge, where all general surgery faculty at the University of Toronto were given the opportunity to complete the SANIUS cultural safety curriculum. This was funded through the General Surgery Chairs Fund. And it was really championed by Carol Swallow, as well as Erin Kennedy and the general surgery EDI leads at the academic hospitals. There were 8 general surgery faculty who'd completed SANIUS as part of their participation in Operation Remote Immunity. And then an additional 59 faculty members completed it between September and December 2021. 84% of the faculty who enrolled, completed the course. And anecdotally, it sounds like reviews from the course were great. We're going to do a formal survey in the next month or two to try to get some additional perspectives. And I think Dr. Swallow is planning a second round for the general surgery faculty who weren't able to do it the first time. And then the other thing that I'm working on is a cultural safety committee or curriculum for general surgery residents. So I've received 2 grants to develop and study cultural safety curricula for surgery residents. One is through the University of Toronto Education Development Fund, and one is a University of Toronto Medical Humanities grant. So we're hoping to roll that out to the general surgery trainees within the next sort of 6 months or so. And I have a number of partners working with me on this project: Jason Pennington, Betty Onyura, Lisa Richardson, as well as Sab Brar. And so I want to close by saying miigwech to Homer for enabling me to participate in this, to Orange, to the NAN leadership. For me, this was really a profound, sort of transformative learning experience. And it's something that's going to sort of stick with me for the rest of my career.
Well, thank you both, Dr. Tiana and Dr. Bischoff. Thank you, Homer, for your leadership, and Danielle for your commitment. And I think what we're seeing and what we're hearing is, a little bit of education, a little bit of awareness leads to a lot of action. I mean, it's action that we could action. It isn't necessarily going to change the world, but it's a starting point. So thank you both. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Laura Snell, who is assistant professor in the Department of Surgery at University of Toronto and a plastic surgeon at Sunnybrook. And she is also one of our co-leads for equity and diversity in the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto. So Dr. Snell, do you want to introduce our next speakers?
Thank you, Avery, and thank you for introducing me to introduce our next 2 speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce 2 of my plastic surgery colleagues as our next 2 speakers today. We have Dr. Sayana Motalji. She is a 3rd-year plastic surgery resident at U of T. She developed an interest in health equity while researching HIV health literacy in refugee women during her undergraduate studies. As a plastic surgery resident here, she's a member of the Global Health Education Initiative. She's also co-chair of the Division of Plastic Surgery's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. And she's also a member of the Northern Plastic Surgery Clinic, which she'll be speaking about since 2019. Our other excellent speaker today is Dr. Jeff Fialkov, who is our fearless leader in the Division of Plastic Surgery at Sunnybrook, as well as an associate professor in the Department of Surgery with a cross appointment to the Institute of Biomedical Engineering at U of T. His clinical focus encompasses the reconstruction of post-traumatic, congenital, and post-ablative craniofacial deformities. Dr. Fialkov is also an associate scientist in the Holland Bone and Joint Research Program at Sunnybrook, where he focuses on craniomaxillofacial reconstructive techniques and translational technologies. Dr. Fialkov is also the clinical lead for the Kovalik Health Center Plastic Surgery Clinic, which he'll be speaking about today, and the founder and chair of the Ontario Association of Craniofacial Trauma Surgeons. I'm very excited to hear their talk today.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thank you, Avery and Jim, Joanna, for putting this together and for the invitation. Let me just share my screen here. Screen share. Sorry, I'll get there. All right. All right, thanks very much. It's really truly an honor to be sharing the podium with such distinguished speakers. You know, in some ways, I'm kind of going to scale things down from from the great and 10,000-foot view size of action that we've heard previously, things that obviously Mr. Megrady has done and Homer, and tell you kind of just a little bit about an effort that I've made to rectify or to help try to rectify some of the disparity that we have in healthcare in this country. So the problem, as we all know, is that in spite of the fact that the Canada Health Act guarantees universal access and equal access to healthcare throughout the country, there's a population that we've been hearing about that doesn't have that equal access. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the north, the far north, as contributing to that disparity in terms of remoteness. I'll briefly just describe the idea for the clinic and how it came to be, what we've done to date. And then I'm going to do something maybe a little bit different, which is I want to share some patient stories with you, because we've learned some very, very profound lessons from just listening to our patients. And Homer touched on how important it is to really listen to the communities that we're trying to serve, to really get direction as to how best to serve them. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to turn things over to Sienna, who's going to give you her perspective as a resident. And also Sienna is going to sort of spearhead our attempts to branch out and do some research and quality assessment. Those of you who attended the Ben Ullman lecture a few weeks ago would have heard Nadine Caron, who was really incredibly impressive speaker. And she showed this slide, which she called the Canadian Venn diagram. This is really an impactful slide, was to me, because that central intersection of all of these demographics, remote, north, rural, and Indigenous, is really the population that we have come to know and serve in Nunavut. They intersect right in the middle. So they really are kind of at the edge of that disparity that we've spoken about. Remoteness is certainly a contributing factor in that regard. There are no hospitals in these small fly-in communities, and therefore there are no surgical services. They have health centers, but not hospitals. And it really struck me, actually, as Mr. Megrady was talking about that disparity, the fact that these communities don't have hospitals. I was really thinking to myself, you're going to hear about Rankin Inlet, which is the capital of this region. Why doesn't Rankin Inlet have a hospital? This is serving a population of 10,000 people. Why doesn't it have a CT scanner? Bracebridge, Ontario, has a hospital with a CT scanner, and its population is 9,000. So really struck me this disparity. So because there are no local surgical services, patients have to be flown out to big centers in the south to receive those surgical services. It's air-only travel, as Homer mentioned, in these remote communities. So they have to fly in, fly out. They often require multiple flights to get to these centers. These are very weather dependent, and there's a lot of inclement weather, so they're often delayed in their access to these services. And that just sort of exacerbates and contributes to even longer wait times, which they baseline have. And medical travel is extremely expensive. The government foots the bill for a significant amount of this, but not everything. And some of these expenses are copay. Accommodation, for instance, meals when they get down to the southern centers like Winnipeg or Edmonton or Ottawa, the patients are often responsible for those expenses. Ground transportation is another example, and as has been touched on previously, this is not an affluent community. These people are poor. They live in interdependent dwellings. You can see these are some of the houses that are just across from the health center where we work. And in one of these 2 or 3 bedroom houses, you wouldn't be surprised to see 8 or 10 people of family and extended family living together. And they're dependent on each other. There's often unemployment. There might be 1 or 2 breadwinners in the family. There might be a hunter or 2 hunters that can go out and provide food for the family and the community. So when people from these dwellings, from these communities and families are away for days at a time because they have to fly to Winnipeg, for instance, to get surgery or even for a consultation, that can have a significant impact on the social fabric of the family, on the economic sustenance of the family. And it's not always just the patient that flies down, because it's very difficult to fly if you've just had surgery, of course, or they may be debilitated to begin with. They often require a chaperone. So that's 2 people from one of these families that may be away for days on end. So the idea is a simple one. It's certainly not a new one. It's one that's kind of a mainstay of global health outreach, of course, which is to bring services and healthcare to the population, to the communities, these remote communities, rather than fly them to centers. But again, the problem, which has been touched on a couple of times now, is that the infrastructure doesn't exist in these communities to be able to sustain and support surgical services. And that's something, of course, that is an issue in of itself. But plastic surgery offers an opportunity because it's quite a transportable specialty. A lot of what we do, we can do with what we affectionately term a fork and a knife, which translates to a scalpel and a forceps. And we can do a lot of very effective functional operations just under local anesthetics. So we don't need necessarily the infrastructure to support general anesthetics and the recovery. We can do a lot of this stuff in a small office type setting, which makes it easier to do in these remote areas. So the goal of this project was simple. It's really to provide high quality plastic and reconstructive surgical services to local communities in the far north, using available resources to reduce wait times, to reduce costs of travel, improve access, and hopefully alleviate the social and economic burden to both the local government, but also to the community members themselves. In a formal sense, this would be a somewhat daunting task. We'd have to do needs assessments, look at what resources are available, figure out the budgets, figure out the logistics, where are we going to do this, how are we going to do it? And that, to me, seemed daunting. But as we all know, it's not what you know, but who you know. And through some political persistence and will, we eventually got to the person who could make it happen. And this is Dr. Francois Dewitt. He is the chief of medical staff for the territory of Nunavut, a real sort of pragmatic leader, very much a can-do person. And we had a 30 to 40 minute preliminary conversation with him, and he immediately took to the idea of trying to bring surgical services up to these communities. And funding was not an issue for him. He immediately saw the practicality and the benefit in terms of financial savings. He also knew where we should go. He directed us to the Kivalliq region, which is the middle central region of Nunavut. There are 3 in total, with a population of approximately 10,000. There are 8 communities in this region. They're all fly-in. And at the time that I spoke to him, which was well before the pandemic, I think it was 2017, there were about 100 plastic surgery consults awaiting to be seen in Winnipeg. And the average wait time at that time, again, pre-pandemic, was 24 months. You can imagine what it would be like now. And that's just for consults, not for surgery. We were going to set up which I mentioned was capital region population of 2,800. Again, is a CT scan for this region. Why is there no hospital for a population of 10,000 for the entire region? And the resources available to us are housed in this building, which is the health center. Again, not a hospital, but a center that has 6 inpatient beds, has a resuscitation room, an X-ray machine, an ultrasound machine. Again, no capacity for surgery, but capacity for sterilization for our instruments. But the greatest asset is the staff. These people are just incredible. They don't know the word no. Everything is possible in spite of the resources and the resource shortages and the neglect, in a sense, that that they get from the government, the federal government. This is the person who is is really truly the project lead, Gracie Takuna. She became our de facto charge nurse, but no longer de facto. She's part of the family. She really personifies that ethos of we can get anything done if the will is there. And that's really what's made this all possible. She figured out the logistics well before we ever arrived, sent us a triage list of patients so we could ensure that they were appropriate consults, figured out the spacing, where we would work, where we would operate. And so she really made it all happen. And so November 2019, Paul Binhammer and I took 2 house staff, Diana, who's going to speak to you shortly, Alan Billig, who was our visiting fellow from Israel at the time. We took 2 flights and held a 4-day clinic, which was kind of a pilot clinic. It was short because we didn't know what to expect in minus 35-degree weather. Since that time, we've held 3 more clinics, and slowly over time, as we've gained the trust of the community, the numbers of patients that we've seen have increased, as you can see in the top line. Paul went back in October of 2021 for sort of a mini follow-up clinic. And this is important. He did that because in August of 2021, which was our last main clinic, there were patients that couldn't have surgery because it was the beginning of hunting season. And so in order to accommodate them, Paul went back to do their hand surgery in October. About half of the patients we see have hand problems. The other half have general plastic surgical problems. So Paul and the residents will do trigger fingers, carpal tunnel surgery there under local anesthetic, nerve transfers, lots of surgeries that really affect the functionality of the local community members. And then I will sort of be responsible for skin lesion excisions, some facial reconstruction, scar revisions. And while we're there during that time, we're on call for any emergent or urgent cases that require our services. We were very cognizant of the problem of follow-up, which is part of the greater problem of access to healthcare services that are lacking. And this is an example of what happens with members of the community who are lost to follow-up in general. This is one of the little boys that we saw who had been treated prior in Winnipeg for a syndactyly, fusion of his fingers. He had them separated and grafted, skin grafted, but unfortunately was lost to follow-up. And by the time we saw him, which was several years later, he had developed this really terrible contracture, which is going to impact his function for the rest of his life, unfortunately. So we were very aware of that problem, and we set up lines of communication with all the nurses and nurse practitioners in the surrounding communities to text us, to call us, to send us pictures so we could, as best as possible, ensure proper and continuous follow-up. So we've learned a lot over the last few years, and I think the lessons are really critical. I mean, they're practical things that we've learned, which we learned by trial and error, like what other equipment we require, what the best staffing ratios are, et cetera. But I think the most important lessons we've learned by listening to our patients to make us better physicians for their community, but also for our community in general. And I think that's really important. So I wanted to share a couple of stories, patient stories with you to try and drive that message home. We've heard it from other speakers, but trust is a huge issue amongst the Indigenous community members. And understandably so, with a history of deceit and exploitation. It's not surprising that it takes time and effort to build trust in the community. This woman presented with a paralysis of the right side of her face, and her vision was impaired. We offered to do a procedure under local anesthetic to suspend her brow and open her visual field, and she was incredulous. She could not believe that the non-Indigenous institutions, population, government would care or bother to provide good quality healthcare locally in Rankin. And so she refused surgery initially. Eventually, she agreed to have it. We did a static brow suspension. Her vision was improved and she was quite happy. I also learned to shed my paternalistic mantle that so many surgeons, I think, have grown to develop, where we think we know what's best for patients in spite of the fact that they really know what's best for them most of the time. This is an example. This gentleman presented with this benign tumor growth on his eyelid, which was also obstructing his vision. And he came to see us and we offered him a simple excision, which would have taken less than 5 minutes, solved the problem, but he refused. And he refused because he had plans to go hunting with his family and friends the next day. And he didn't want to take any chances, regardless how low the risk, of impeding that hunting trip. Of course, hunting is not a sport for this community. It's a way of life. It's a means of sustenance. And so this was more important to him at the time. Now, I did express my concern about the fact that he was using a firearm and couldn't see out of his right eye. But he responded, I just tell my friends and family to stand to the left. The disparity that you saw with the little boy and his hand contracture was really evident with many, many patients. This was a gentleman who had bilateral ptosis, which is a laxity of, or a ptosis or droopiness of his upper eyelids, also impairing his visual fields. And he had had this repaired 2 years prior in Winnipeg. And unfortunately, which does happen, he had a relapse. But he had been waiting 2 years to hear back from Winnipeg to see if anything could be done, if it could be revised, et cetera, and hadn't heard back. So we offered to repair this for him and repair his ptosis. Once again, that distrust surfaced, and he permitted us to do it, but only on one eye to see how things would go. And I'm happy to report that it was successful. We hope he returns to do the other eye in our next clinic. We learned that the breadth of issues and the legacy of colonialism has a scope well beyond our ability to address. But we made the best effort to do what we could within our scope. This young woman, unfortunately, was a victim of domestic violence. She came to us with a nasal fracture, which was displaced. And this was actually our first case in which we used conscious sedation. We hope to expand that service actually in the future. We were able to sedate her with the help of one of the visiting family doctors and reduce her nose successfully. Sienna is going to speak a little bit about our plans to determine the impact on the community from a health perspective, a quality assurance perspective. But one thing is certain immediately, which is that we've saved the government a significant amount of money. For the government to send 100 patients to Winnipeg to have consultation and surgery costs approximately $2.9 million. For us to do the same surgery, which we do on the same day, so it's not multiple trips, we do it the same day as the consultation, costs the government about $184,000 and about $66,000 to fly us up and accommodate us for the week that we're there to see that number of patients. And so we're saving the government over $2 million each time we see 100 patients, money which can hopefully go to better purposes like infrastructure, hospitals, a CT scanner, which we're desperately in need of up there. We don't have numbers yet, and Sai is going to speak to that in terms of that impact that I referred to on the community. But from an anecdotal sense, we know or we sense that the community is getting to know us. We feel that word has spread, which is why the numbers in our clinics are going up. And we feel that we're building trust. It's probably not there yet, but it's growing. And there's this, which was honorable mention by the Minister of Health in the Nunavut legislature, that we are having an impact, positive impact on the community. With that, I'd like to thank, first of all, the staff at the health center, who are just, as I said, unbelievable, very special people. And also my colleagues, Paul, Sienna, Celine, Grace, Alan, who have really been stalwart in their efforts to make this a successful initiative. So I'm going to hand things over to Sienna, who's going to give you a learner's perspective, her perspective on our project.
Thank you, Dr. Fialkov. It has been a distinct pleasure to witness the growth of this operation. Year one was about learning a new clinical flow and laying the land for success. Adapting to surgical life in Arctic Canada meant being flexible in an environment where resources differ and life bends to the weather. When a storm canceled our patients from Whale Cove, we filled our clinic with the local ENT backlog. When we had facial fractures and no CT access, we went back to basics with facial X-ray. In patient encounters, our strength was acknowledging that we were starting from scratch. We were introducing a brand new idea that having surgery at the health center is possible and that we were qualified to do it. Some patients were skeptical, and we left room for that. Trust came with time and without errors or assumptions.
Our relationships blossomed in year 2. We reconnected with past patients and built on our bonds at the health center. I also fit in my annual physical from a bright future physician. Year 3 brought a deeper understanding of the community as our conversations and experiences extended beyond the walls of the health center. We went out on land and experienced the beauty of the Arctic. We had discussions about the issues that burden our Inuk friends and patients. We experienced the water crisis and learned about elders being sent to long-term care in Ottawa long before seeing these issues in the news. We don't have the tools to address these complex issues. They don't come in a plastic surgery procedure tray. But these conversations are a privilege and allow us to see our unique position as a bridge between home and Rankin. I hope that in the future, we can utilize our contacts, our platform as advocates, and our connection to the community to build supports beyond surgical care. Research was not a part of our original mission, in part because the exploitation of Indigenous patients and data is a well-known issue. However, with the successful practice and local support, the conversation turned to creating a study with 4 purposes: to ensure we are having a positive impact, to optimize our clinic, to explore the role for expansion, and to serve as a model for groups interested in a similar clinic. From the inception of our research, we have been working closely with local authorities to ensure this work is done in a way that is culturally safe, regulated, and to the benefit of the community. Our close consultants have been the Territorial Chief of Staff, the Manager of Population Health Information, and the Nunavut Research Institute. Our primary objective is to identify the effect of the clinic on wait times, cost of care, and quality of care in the Kavalik region for the top 5 diagnoses we see, as compared to treatment in a southern center for the same condition. Our secondary objective is to capture the effect of our clinic through a qualitative lens by interviewing stakeholder groups of healthcare workers, patients, and elders who are the leaders of the community. This project has posed unique challenges. Approval to conduct research in Nunavut entails rigorous review. We currently have licensure for internal review and are awaiting a full research license. COVID has strained human resources in Nunavut and impacted delays. Finally, data collection requires access to both paper charts and electronic records at the health center. Our research assistant will be joining our next clinic for this reason, and a prospective database is also being established. These direct quotes from early qualitative interviews illustrate the clinic's impact. Every week, 1 to 2 referrals are made, and from other communities. Wait times for trigger finger were 1 year, 2.5 years. With COVID, that wait time is longer. For the local clinic, it is less than 5 months. Going to Winnipeg, the downside is if you are working, it becomes difficult to get time off. Plus, you have children, you need to arrange childcare. Patients say, with respect to our clinic, when are they coming again? My hope is to complete our needs assessment in the coming year. We will continue with biannual clinics and look forward to returning in April. Finally, I look forward to seeing how we continue to grow, whether in the capacity for more complex procedures, implementation in other communities, offshoot initiatives, or simply continuing to do the work that we are doing and deepening our roots in Rankin. Thank you for your time, and a special thank you to Dr. Fialkov for allowing me to be a part of something so meaningful.
Great, I want to thank you both, and we'll discuss, I think, at the panel discussion, whether this can be expanded, whether other potential procedures can be done with the resources available, or perhaps ways we might be able to expand the resources. So thank you both. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Dulia Hamad. Dulia is one of our general surgery residents who is currently in our surgeon scientist training program, and she's going to introduce our last speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Nathans. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Selena Nahani. Selena is a current PGY3 resident in orthopedic surgery at the University of Toronto. She obtained her medical degree from U of T, concurrent with a master's in system leadership and innovation through the Dalhousie School of Public Health. She also obtained a PhD from Queen's University and her bachelor's degree with honors in physics from University of Waterloo. Selena is passionate about increasing representation of Indigenous learners in medicine, and in particular, the surgical fields. She believes in the translation of community-sourced strategies to post-secondary education models to empower and support Indigenous people in their goal for self-determination. This includes access to and the providing of healthcare. She believes that in an evidence-based approach, couched in respectful data, handling to address community wellness that will empower the next generation of learners. Her current research interests are in understanding barriers faced by women considering surgical residency, with a particular interest in the intersection of race, gender, socioeconomic status, and surgical training. She has previously worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Rural Alberta Development Fund. She's also led numerous cultural exchange programs to Musimi, Moose Factory, Mishkegu Gaman, and Six Nations. She's a member of the Lidi Kwai Dene First Nations, and also a wife and a mother to two wonderful children. So Dr. Nahani, I will give you the floor now.
Thank you, Julia. That was very nice. Okay, so let me try and share my screen. Did that work? Excellent, thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for everyone for joining and attending this session. I want to say in particular thank you to Dr. Nathans, who invited me to speak today. He's a mentor of mine from medical school. I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. Again, my name is Selena Nahani. I am a third-year orthopedic surgery resident here at U of T, and I'm going to speak to you about Indigenous learners in surgery, some challenges and some opportunities. So there are certainly have been a lot of efforts that have recently started, and there's a lot of room for growth, so which makes this a really exciting field. Okay. So I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I'm speaking to you from North York. This is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This is traditional Treaty 13 territory, and it's subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. That was originally a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. And subsequent colonial settlers have come in and are always invited to partake in the treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So I wanted to start off this talk with just providing a little perspective on who I am and the lens that I have for the work that I do and have done. I am a status member of the Lidlikwe First Nations Dene Band of the Ditcho in the Northwest Territories. And I am the daughter of Phoebe Nahani. This is her over here. Oh, I was out of sync with my arrow. That's me in the Snuggie. And that's my brother Taj. I think that it's really important to give perspective on where a person has come from, because it gives an idea for their motivations for what keeps them going. And so what I guess keeps me going is the story that I grew up with of my mother's survival in terms of what she went through. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. So my mother, Phoebe, was a residential school survivor. She came from very modest means. Her father was a trapper, so that was his profession. He lived off the land, and when she was about 4 years old, she was abducted and brought to a Roman Catholic residential school where she was subject to corporal punishment. And at the time, with the goal of assimilation, children were routinely beaten for speaking their language or participating in their own ceremonies. And this is particularly troublesome given the fact that most of these children were unilingual, speaking of their language. And so this would make for a very, very challenging transition. And, you know, indeed challenging throughout the experience. Once she left residential school, she relocated herself down to Southern Ontario to attend university at Western. And throughout this whole period of, you know, after she left high school and came down south, she was, of course, subject to the same problems that many Indigenous women face, particularly Indigenous women who did not have any financial means, in that she was very vulnerable. So she was always very stoic about the things that she went through, and didn't disclose many of these things until many years later, but she was actually subject to multiple violent assaults. And having gone through the residential school system, she was never comfortable approaching the police about these. So these were very violent assaults that absolutely could have been prosecuted, and these people were never arrested, were never held accountable. And I would never use the word lucky to describe her experience, but I'm certainly very grateful that she didn't end up being one of the many missing and murdered Indigenous women in our country. So I think one of the things that I've taken out of her experience, or that I've sort of gleaned off of this terrible experiences, is that it's important to remember that Indigenous people, all Indigenous people usually have a shared trauma experience in the very recent history. So many Indigenous people have experienced a lot of violence directly, and certainly are subject to the generational trauma associated with colonialism, residential schools, as well as the 60s scoop. So there are many facets to this issue that create a very multidimensional picture that feeds into the subject of this talk, which is, of course, medical education. All right. So having heard my mother's story as the background for why I am motivated by this work, I'd like to move forward. Okay. So, Indigenous medical learners, recruitment to medicine for Indigenous learners is a challenge in general. About less than 1% of practitioners are Indigenous, and the rates of recruitment have definitely increased recently, but we're still only up to about 15% the per capita rates of recruitment compared to the general population. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And then further to that, recruitment of Indigenous learners into surgical specialties is much, much smaller. So I had a conversation along with Dr. Nathans with Dr. Pennington from Scarborough General, and he was saying that he could count his surgical colleagues, his surgical Indigenous colleagues, on one hand. I know of a few more who are in training, in surgical training, but certainly the numbers are always quite small, and we still get excited when we find each other. So I did this master's in system leadership and innovation, and I learned about Ishikawa diagrams, and I think these things are just great. So I'm not putting this slide up for anyone to read in detail, but I just wanted to illustrate the sort of the breadth of the problem, or I shouldn't say the breadth of the problem, the breadth of the issue. There are many different ways that you can slice the problem, which is low Indigenous representation in surgical training. I've broken it down into these 5 categories, for my own benefit. This is a living document on my computer that I sort of update intermittently, and this one is simplified from the outline that I had prior to putting this talk together. I put it down into recruitment, policies, procedures, place/culture, and learners. And a lot of the emphasis is put around the recruitment piece. So, how do we get more Indigenous learners into the program? So how do we, take from this relatively small applicant pool and encourage them to apply to surgery? But you can trace this way further back from just medical school. We can talk about lack of opportunities in secondary education. We can talk about lack of opportunities in undergraduate education to get people into medical school. So the problem is very, very big and very multifaceted. And those could be PhD theses on their own. Again, the focus is often on recruitment. The other thing that I want to highlight in this picture is this the curved line that tracing up over the screen. There is a massive cultural pressure in surgery to sort of conform the learner to the surgical culture. The surgical culture is often looked as sort of like a monolith, that we have this formula for education that our learners will benefit from if they are, if they're able to sort of make it through the training. And I have, I obviously take a bit of issue with that. I can appreciate the value in it a great deal. I sort of have a case log of all the cases that I've seen in residency so far, so that when I'm out in practice and I am given a tough decision, I can look back through my experiences through residency to get an idea of how to best manage this. So I'm always eager to gain more exposure and grow my sort of my catalog in my brain. But that comes at a cost. So surgical training is tough. Nobody ever presents it as being easy. But the question becomes, when does the training move from a beneficial challenge that helps you grow and turns you into a very well-trained, disciplined surgeon versus becoming an insurmountable obstacle? And that's a question that I've struggled with quite a bit, because, for example, in my program in orthopedics, which it's a great program, an amazing field, and I'm always happy to be here. But it's designed to be a tough program. It's designed to be a tough program for even someone who's had, all the advantages, so the stereotype is, a athletic, heterosexual, cisgendered white male. And it's designed to be tough for that person. It's designed to be hard for them. So what happens when suddenly the trainee is a woman, or a woman of color, or in my case, an Indigenous mother, or a transgendered person, a person with a disability? You start to get into these deeper philosophical questions of what kind of person can we train to be a surgeon? And if you apply that question to the list of labels that I just went through, you start to have to ask yourself some very uncomfortable questions. Who can make it through this training program, and who are we allowing to make through this training program? So anyways, I digress because I want to focus on some more positive things, but these are important philosophical questions to ask about, like the culture of medicine. So recruitment and retention in surgical training, there are some specific things that we know are an issue. So we don't really have very many culturally specific supports or resources. There are some things available, for example, in other faculties, but we don't necessarily have that in surgery yet. I put here also many Indigenous people are apprehensive towards the medical system. This is a little bit more higher up in terms of, or further up the pipeline in terms of who would apply to medical school. But surgery is often regarded as sort of, like this epitomized, Western medicine structure, whereas family medicine, psychiatry, and even general internal medicine have adapted much more welcoming environments for differential trainees. So we haven't nurtured that as much in surgery. So that would be an area for growth. There are also few Indigenous role models in surgery. I mentioned before Dr. Pennington, as well as a handful of other faculty, but we don't really have too many people that we can approach about, how to navigate surgery as an Indigenous person. There are also socioeconomic barriers. So I think it's been brought up a few times that there's a big issue with poverty amongst many Indigenous communities. So to create opportunities for people from Indigenous communities inherently requires creating opportunity for people of lower socioeconomic statuses. And I'm always very cognizant that my profession is going to lead me into a pay grade that's going to give me a lot of financial security, and I'm very grateful for that. I guess what I'm trying to highlight is that there is like a hump that just needs to be surmounted during the training period that requires a lot of both financial capital, but also like a lot of support from the community, your community, your family supports that can sometimes be a challenge. Another thing that we don't talk about very much is that there are a lot of responsibilities that Indigenous people have, and these are certainly not specific to Indigenous groups, but trainees might have family responsibilities or cultural responsibilities that take time, and surgical training is very time intensive, and there isn't really a precedent for creating space for people who have those kinds of responsibilities. The attitude at this point is very much to work as hard as you can during your training, and then it'll be done, and then you can go back to your family and your responsibilities. So what do you do if that's not really an option? What if you say you have a dependent, like a child, or you have an infirm partner or parent that you have to take care of? So that becomes again, it stops being a challenge and starts being an obstacle. And then there's the issues of surgical culture, so systemic racism and inertia. And people always get uncomfortable with the word racism, but I think that there's a growing understanding that the term systemic racism really refers to an education gap. So people will carry on with their processes and doing the things that they've done before without realizing that these are obstructive to historically oppressed groups. So there's been a lot of talk about, for example, Mr. Megrady was talking about Indigenous people not being at the table for discussion when the French and the English were distributing land in Canada. So that exclusion at that time probably was intentional, but sometimes this exclusion is unintentional and that people just don't think about it. But that is systemic racism, and it's quite rampant amongst most institutions, health institutions obviously included in this. And then there's the issue of microaggressions. So this is something that I think is also, like a research topic unto itself in surgical culture. The trouble is that when you take someone who comes from, a traumatic background and who has, might be carrying a lot of emotional, like a history of their emotional struggles with them, then you put them in an environment that, is just purely designed to challenge them, and it has a lot of these little microaggressions in it. You are going to push some people out of the program, and that certainly does happen. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some U of T initiatives. There are some great programs here at U of T that are trying to address low representation of Indigenous learners. I don't want to go through every single one of these, but I want to highlight a couple that are near to my heart. For example, the Summer Mentorship Program, which is run by Ike Okafor out of the Temerty School of Medicine. He also runs a community of support that helps support underrepresented groups in applying to medical school. So this is targeted at people who would be sort of first in their family to go into medicine. And they would set them up with mentors, help them write their CV, help them navigate the application process, MCAT preparation courses, and interview preparation. And in terms of the PGME, we have recently in 2017, the Royal College introduced Indigenous health as a component to the PGME curriculum. So we have many new initiatives sort of popping up and to help increase education opportunities. And of course, we have our new EDI directors, Dr. Snell and Dr. Safedin, who are doing a great job as well. We have our program, the SPARK program, run by Dr. Morel Norris over at Sunnybrook, which is also very promising. All right. So I should say very promising and hopefully can translate over to surgery. Okay, so in terms of future directions, I think that developing culturally informed supports for learners is going to be really critical. And just to create a more inviting environment for Indigenous persons to want to learn in and work in. Recruiting more Indigenous faculty, which I think is on the mandate, but sort of one of these things that can be challenging to do. We talked a little bit earlier on with about increasing Indigenous health education for faculty and staff. So there's a lot of cultural training opportunities that we can make standardized across for both faculty as well as learners. And when I say staff, I mean nursing staff, allied health, like other people that will be interacting with our learners. Of course, we can always increase funding for Indigenous health research. And probably the biggest thing and the most challenging thing will be culture shift in surgery. So changing the face of surgery, changing what we think a surgeon looks like as a department, but also, in terms of like society's expectations of this, and changing the expectations of what a surgical trainee is expected to do. And this sort of speaks back to the points I was making before about, this idea of putting our trainees into this crucible and have them, come out these changed diamonds. We have this myth of meritocracy ethos that sort of gives us the idea that, if a trainee is good enough, they'll make it through the program. But I think that back when I was doing physics, we had this saying that we have that you have like proof by existence. So the proof that I would say that this is not necessarily the way to approach this is that we don't have even distribution of women and Indigenous people, and indeed historically underrepresented groups continue to be underrepresented. So I think that that is a good argument that the system inherently has to change and has to be adapted. And I wanted to close with an acknowledgement of all my relations. So this is to situate myself both within my family and in my greater community. I'm continue to be motivated both by my mother Phoebe's story, as well as for the benefit of my two children. This is Hunter here on the left, and that's Phoebe, obviously named after my mother, on the right. And I'd also like to include my wonderful sister. She is a family doctor and emergency room doctor up in Moose Factory, Moosonee, and that's her with her daughter Giselle. So Masi Cho, very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Dr. Nahani, that was fantastic. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. And it has been a pleasure seeing you develop into the surgeon that you are. We started, I probably got to know you as a medical student many years ago, but it's amazing to see what you've accomplished thus far.
Thank you.
So now we have plenty of time for panel discussion. You're welcome to either pick up your hand or put a question into the chat for any of our speakers today. So while people are gathering their thoughts, why don't I start off with perhaps a question for Dr. Tien. The vaccine confidence issue, a challenge certainly outside of Operation Remote Immunity. We've seen many challenges to getting the vaccine out, probably much worse south of the border than what we're seeing here in Canada. But we've also seen many leaders who have actually expressed some concerns about the vaccine. It was clear that you pointed out how important it was to get the leaders on board, but was there any issue around vaccine confidence around Indigenous leaders that you had to work through?
Yeah, there were, but it was actually a much smaller, it was actually not a major problem. I think there was maybe one community really that I think of that there was some serious vaccine hesitancy at the leadership level. The rest of them actually were first in line to show leadership from the front. And so lots of discussion about how we could broadcast they're getting their vaccine as to their communities on radio shows. So they were very involved in the vaccine hesitancy issue, and they recognized that would be the major issue, and they were very effective in combating it in most of these communities.
Okay, thank you. And I think Mr. Megrady is still on, but this is there's some questions coming up. Perfect. So Joanna, I'm unable, okay, I see. So Dr. Safadine.
Hello, everyone. I have a comment and question to Mr. Megrady. Thank you very much for your talk speaking truth to power, and for reminding us in medicine that there's much more to it than health. It's a structural issue. And when you spoke about the law and the racist laws that prevent Indigenous communities from changing their lot, we also know that there are many communities in the within Indigenous peoples that are mounting a really amazing resistance to ongoing racism and dispossession. Particularly, I think about land defenders, for example. And given that there are many people on this call that are obviously privileged people like ourselves as surgeons and belong to different organizations, any comments from yourself about how we can be allies and in solidarity with all these movements that are actually trying to change the power differential, which is at the core of the problem, that although it's not directly a health issue today for us to solve, but obviously we can hopefully as citizens be part of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank for that question. I think you saw examples of what can be done on the ground by members of your profession, and good examples were discussed today. But also from the last speaker, Dr. Nahani, you could see that there are more specific things that can be done for increasing our own capacity to become doctors and so on, and be available to our own communities. But the main issue that I was talking about was this idea of exclusion from decisions that impact a country, or decisions that impact my nation, for example, the Cree Nation, and that the power is not with us. It's actually either in Parliament or in the legislatures. So what we need here is a constitutional change, because we have to fundamentally change the power structure of the country. And the last opportunity we had to do that was with Brian Mulroney, that resulted in something called the Charitable Accord. Of course, it failed in a referendum. However, it was an effort, at least, to try to come up with a way of recognizing that Indigenous people should be self-governing, and that the federal system is not a perfect system of governance for the country, and that Indigenous people have the right of self-determination and their sovereignty should be part of this landscape called Canada. Now, what we heard from people like Chrétien when he became Prime Minister was that Canadians have what he called constitutional fatigue. I remember saying at the time, that's one virus I never caught. But it shows you the resistance, though, of people in power from carrying on with the project that was started by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. that was not his goal. I mean, he was forced to do that when he patriated the Constitution. The leadership at that time across the country forced Canada to recognize we have treaty and Aboriginal rights that should be protected by the supreme law of the land. Trudeau's goal was not that. It was the idea of maintaining peace in the constitutional structure of the country by making sure Quebec was satisfied with their place in this country. But at the same time, he sneaked in something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was his own personal agenda. But the idea of recognizing treaty and Aboriginal rights was not Trudeau's agenda, but he was forced to recognize it had to be done, that structural change was required. And we had a decade of constitutional discussions that didn't result in anything. So they resulted in total failure. And I was part of that effort. Like the last thing that failed was what is called a Charitable Accord. And that's the closest we came to some kind of a political agreement amongst very conservative premiers across the country. People who thought that their mission in life was to protect their jurisdiction as provinces, and were not inclined to share power or even make room for Indigenous peoples to have power within the country. So you can imagine how difficult those discussions would have been, because I was the lead negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations as their national chief at that time. That's another story. Someday, maybe when we have time, we can have a chat on that. But you're absolutely right, though. In the absence of real structural reform, including supporting groups that are protecting their land rights, and using your influence as a person of influence to try to get the governments to recognize that the status quo is no longer possible. That the First Nations people, they're on a rise right now. You saw Dr. Nahani. We have many young people like that, very educated, very informed, very, very bright. And they're championing the cause right now in their own specific fields, whether it's in education or health, or as in this case with the University of Toronto. In my case, like in my own experience, I had a minor influence too in terms of structural reform at the institutional level, meaning through my efforts and other First Nation students at the University of Manitoba, we were able to get a Native Studies program going. Can you imagine that in the 1970s? There was no such thing at the University of Manitoba. So, but those are just institutional changes. They're important, and they contribute in terms of making this a better place for everyone. But the power and the wealth still resides somewhere else. And it's not with First Nations people or the Inuit people or with the Métis people of this country. But you have more power as a doctor than I do. Like, I'm just a former national chief and a forgotten guy altogether. So no power whatsoever to influence any government to do the right thing. But within your own society, the doctors have always had a prominent role in shaping public opinion as well as shaping the policies of government. So I think that's why I mentioned at the beginning that if anything, you should be advocates for a better healthcare system that recognizes Indigenous sovereignty over health and forces the governments or encourages the governments or persuades the governments, whatever, to allocate the fiscal resources needed to have care at home, as opposed to the highway being the hospital or the airplane being your hospital or access to care. And then what I heard today, I'm very encouraged, by the way, with what Dr. Tian and others have shared with us, with the clinics that are happening in Nunavut territory. This is very much what we need in the Nan territory right now, that kind of partnerships. And my recommendation was to negotiate those partnerships with the First Nations directly. You know, expand your reach, your global reach as an institution and as doctors. And through negotiations, you know, you'll be doing things like what was shared here, doing things according to what's appropriate, like cultural safety and all that, and then cultural competency and all those things that people talk about now. They will automatically appear in negotiations when you recognize First Nations, their self-determination over health, and you treat them in that way, as opposed to going or running to the federal government or the province for jurisdiction issues. But recognizing that First Nations have authority and jurisdiction and proceeding that way. A de facto recognition of their authority over their people and the health conditions and the health future of their people. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that. Dr. Arrett?
Thanks, Avery. My question is directed to Mr. Megrady and to Jeff and Sienna. Firstly, to Jeff and Sienna, congratulations on going and doing the work you've done in Rankin. I've had experience in going to Rankin. I've been there 6 times. And the first couple of times I went on information gathering and to try to see what the needs were up there. And it was quite successful. I was on a radio show for a couple of hours talking to all the people, and it seemed like we were making some progress. And we got funding to go to the Rankin Hospital to build an operating room and potentially have a CAT scan. We also had funding for transportation and accommodation when we were there. So I wrote a 20-page report on what we could do and what we can bring 5 surgical specialties up, including OBGYN, ENT, ophthalmology, urology, and general surgery. Now, and with all their input, there's not many doctors up there, but with the nurse practitioners and those people in the clinic. After that 20-page report and meeting with the premier, I got a letter, one sentence letter saying we're not interested in this. I'd like to know, maybe it was me, I'm willing to take the responsibility, but we went 6 times and we felt like we were getting somewhere. And I'd like to know, where are the roadblocks? And by the way, we've had other success that we're just starting in Labrador, and it's with open arms, they will welcome us. So I'd like to know if you could explain, you don't be shy, you can tell me where I went wrong, or how to do it better.
Well, you didn't go wrong, somebody else did. The person that said no to you had no authority, in my opinion, to make that decision for the population. He may have had an official position as a premier or whatever, and he may have been advised by his policy advisors to send that letter to you. I don't know the background, but no one person should prevent any progress from happening in any community. But if you deal directly with the First Nation people themselves and the Inuit leadership, you'll get more progress. Because they're used to having obstacles to the exercise of their own autonomy. We know from I think you heard me say when I was chief of Grand Rapids, how we had to deal with jurisdictional issues that were made between the feds and the provinces, and nothing to do with our authority of our people. But if you were to come to my community with that plan, if I was chief of still in that community, you'd be widely received. So that's always been my recognize that Canada is not complete. It may be a country based on what they call federation of provinces and the federal government, two levels of government. But the reality is that our people have self-determination. And now that we have the Declaration of Indigenous Rights, governments across the country are now being forced to acknowledge that. But you can enhance it as a doctor by going directly to our leaders and working directly with them. Next time you do that, you'll no one will say no to you, not from the Indigenous community anyway.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Dr. Rutka?
Thanks, Avery, and thanks to all the speakers. Very powerful, very important presentations today, and really, I'm very proud of what I heard from the Department of Surgery. I guess my question is directed mostly to Selena, and it has to do with the role models that you talked about in Indigenous communities for professional positions, let's say surgical residencies like orthopedics, and how we can encourage a pipeline to come out of earlier and more formative educational phases. You mentioned secondary school. I actually think the pipeline should start earlier. Maybe we have to do it from kindergarten, or truly to make this awareness in public schools. And so is there, the question is, like, anything being done currently in the school boards or in the Indigenous communities to try to get this message out that you can do this, and this is something that's being promoted and supported, so the pipeline will begin earlier.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent point. That absolutely there are some initiatives. I think that there's been a lot more discussion about this. So the work of Cindy Blackstock has sort of brought into the forefront the disparities in funding for education of Indigenous children. So, there was a large case brought against the government with regards to the differential in funding, which was that, a child going to a public school in downtown Toronto is allocated, somewhere between $10,000 and $11,000 of funding to go through the public school system. And comparatively, that was about $6,000 on residential, on reserve. So they're right from the start put at a disadvantage. So the quality of the education is always less. The resources that the teachers have to work with is less. From my discussions with teachers on reserve, they have sort of a rotation of teachers that go out to some of the communities, will work for a couple of years and leave. So there's a lack of continuity of the teachers out there. So really, this all feeds into the bigger problem of educating our population. And consequently, we have quite high dropout rates. So we talk about the rates of attrition getting out of high school, but we have very significant attrition to get in even entering high school. So we have a lot of people who stop their education at around the grade 6 to 8 level. So there is a lot of work to be done. A lot of the solutions seem to be around taking, people out of the community and bringing them to places of higher resources. Like, I think this is sort of like a de facto model. Like we talked, I think, the talk of, how much cheaper it is to bring surgeons out to these remote communities versus flying people in. Like there's a very sound financial argument to be made for building resources locally that for some reason doesn't seem to stick. I know at U of T, the surgery interest group started hosting some workshops at some high schools about just educating people on medicine and trying to specifically promote surgery. And those were well received. I think they were published in, let me see, I think on the call, we have Lucas here on the call. He can actually speak to the specifics of this. We had a wonderful discussion about this. Lucas, can you tell us about that?
Hi there. Yeah, I'm one of the third year Indigenous medical students at U of T. And I was part of the surgery interest group that helped organize these workshops. Basically, they were just workshops on CV building, introduction to CanMed's roles, research, et cetera, for underrepresented communities starting at the high school level. So we ran 2 of these workshops last year, very well received. I think we had a total of 50 students or so. We had an abstract published in it was Canadian Journal of Surgery based on that, but we were invited back again, and it seemed like the students really appreciated that as well as the teachers. But again, I mean, it's tough. Even the high school level might be a little too late to get that going, but we do think that it's really important, just to show these students that, this is an option for you. And, here are some of the tools that can help you get ahead and help prepare you for the, application process overall.
Mm-hmm. So I think a model like that could also be expanded to earlier levels of education, but it becomes a question of resources and manpower. So we need an army of motivated medical students like Lucas to get into the classrooms and to get the word out. We talked about building infrastructure on reserves. That's a big undertaking, and it's a multifaceted problem. It's not easily solved, but we have a lot of good people working on it, and I think there's some good initiatives here that are hopefully getting things off the ground.
Thanks for your question. Next is actually one from Dr. Jemick, who one of our plastic surgeons. She asked, this is for Jeff and team. So what's the frequency of your visits dependent on? Is it your availability? Is it funds? Give us a sense of what the limitations are to expanding that. And is there any training of local staff?
So excellent question, Barbara. Thank you for that. So we've learned as we've gone along, and what we've tried to do throughout this initiative is to listen to the local, not just the local population, but the local staff. They've worked very, very hard to establish an incredibly effective means of providing healthcare with the resources that they're given to the local population. And so one of the things we're very sensitive to is not to come in with guns a-blazing and say this is how it should be done, because they've established something very, very special. And so in that regard, we've looked to them to tell us how frequently we need to go. And at this point, what they've asked us to do, and every time we've gone back, we've waited for them to ask us and get a sense of what the need is through them, from their mouths. And what we've established is that the twice a year, the semi-annual visit, semi-annual clinic is what works best. And part of that has to do, again, with the sensitivity to lifestyle and the community needs, because the hunting and fishing seasons don't allow them to have surgery. They're not able to have surgery on our whim and when we can be there. We have to be appreciative and sensitive to their needs and their requirements. And so we've established that twice a year in the spring and in the fall, after the hunting season in the fall and just before in the spring, would be good times to come to deliver those services and to follow up on patients that we had seen 6 months prior. That's the first answer. It's not based on funding, because as you saw from the tables, we're already saving the government an incredible amount of money. So funding has never been an issue. They see the practicality of what we're doing, and they've backed us entirely. There's never been a question about that. As far as training local staff, that's a great question, and it kind of brings me a little bit to what Jim was asking. So one of the things that has struck us every time, we've been there 4 times now, and each time we go there, it strikes us that all of the medical staff and paramedical staff are non-Indigenous. The support staff there are lots of Indigenous support staff, but the doctors are mostly visiting. Well, they're all visiting doctors. There are no people that are there permanently. The nursing staff live there, but they're not Indigenous, at least not in Rankin. And that's something that really stands out. What we've done, we've just initiated this actually, is we've approached the high school, the local high school, to ask students if they'd like to shadow us. Indigenous Inuk students from the high school, if they'd like to come and just watch what we do for a day. We got an amazing response, an incredible response from the vice president of the vice principal of the high school, who actually said there were about 8 students interested in their graduating class. 2 of them, one of them has been accepted to a pre-medical program already. And the other one has been accepted to nursing at UBC. And so the vice principal chose those two to shadow us on our next trip in April. And it's our hope that, as Sienna kind of alluded to, that just through these small, we're really working on a micro scale again, compared to the stuff that, Homer has done, for instance, but on a small scale, and hopefully this maybe, we hope that it'll act as inspiration for others to do things on a small scale. On a small scale, maybe we can influence beyond the scope of just our plastic surgical skills. If we can inspire a couple of high school kids to go on and become a nurse or a plastic surgeon, even, for instance, to come back to Rankin and serve their community locally, that would be, that's a dream. Whether it happens or not, of course, is out of our hands, but we hope to maybe start a little bit of a ripple effect. So those are the sorts of things that we are looking to the community to guide us with, as opposed to, as I said, coming in and telling the community what we think they need. It goes back to that story about the hunter with the benign tumor over his eyelid. He had to tell us what he needed, and we had to listen to him.
Thanks, Jeff. Dr. Snell.
Hi, thanks, Avery. So I have a comment and a question for Selena. I'm gonna pick on you again, I guess, or highlight some of the great things that you actually commented on. The first is that actually you mentioned the SPARK program, and I know we've talked about it before, and we actually are expanding it to surgery starting this year. So for anyone that hasn't heard of the SPARK program, it's a Sunnybrook program to access research knowledge started by Dr. Muriel Norris and Jill Tinmouth last year at Sunnybrook in the Department of Surgery. And it's a research mentorship program for Black and Indigenous medical students, where they're provided with a stipend to complete a research project. As well, they are also given a community and a career mentor. And we have funding, thank you, Avery, for 3 students in the Department of Surgery. So we'll be sending out a call for mentors within the next few days, maybe even later today, to tell you how to apply to be a research mentor. So it did work, Selena. We've got it in the Department of Surgery like we were hoping. The second thing was, what you were saying about and this is, I guess, a big question that I don't expect you to answer, but just maybe your thoughts on it, is our programs in residency in surgery are geared to challenge those, like you said, that have every advantage, and that's how they've, well, not always, but that have a lot of advantages, and that's how they've gotten into the program, and it's challenging for those groups of residents. So for other residents, it's maybe insurmountable. And then on top of that, we're, for example, expecting sometimes the Indigenous lonely, resident like yourself to advocate for your entire, group or population to try to get more Indigenous residents into your program, for example, and that's a big burden. How can we help as faculty, for example, in the Department of Surgery to support the Indigenous learners like yourself, or mothers or females or anybody that isn't, advantaged in every aspect of as you're coming through the program? What can we do once you've made it into the program?
Wow. I have a long list of requests. No. Well, I think that some of the most important places to start, there's sort of like the list of my wish list of, many, 24-hour childcare and, travel stipends and all these sorts of things. But I think the more realistic thing to start with would be education for faculty and staff. So when I was mentioning before, like the Sanyas education, I think that was mentioned by Dr. Bitchoff about, the Sanyas education, cultural education opportunities for faculty. I think that's a good place to start, to have an understanding of just where Indigenous people are coming from, some of the challenges that they face, and what kind of burdens they have to carry with them on a day-to-day basis, and how that can influence and impact their performance as trainees. So there's this, and I also think that it would be beneficial to sort of more aggressively address, sort of like the rigidness of surgical culture. I've seen it a few times that people will, they'll be thinking about entering the program, or they'll enter the program and they just kind of don't mesh with, the surgical group. Like they don't seem to, talk like a surgeon. They don't seem to act like a surgeon. And, there's a lot to be said for the experience of my senior colleagues, and they sort of understand better than I do what kind of person succeeds in this line of work. But I think that we may be missing a large cohort of very capable, talented surgeons when we sort of apply this hidden curriculum onto these trainees, and they end up getting pressured out of applying. It's a big change. It's a big cultural, a big cultural shift that I don't think would happen easily, but I think that there's been more and more discussion about it. And I would like to see that discussion grow. And I think that would be to the benefit of both Indigenous trainees, but any, historically repressed group or, underrepresented group, I think would benefit from that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. It's interesting, Selena, you brought up a lot of good points about surgical training. And there is a body of literature that has started to question where we are and why we're here. And we're here, really, it's the Halstedian tradition, where people would give up everything else in life and focus on living in the hospital. The truth is that Halsted, had a surgical practice that was fueled by cocaine.
It was.
He was able to work 24/7 because of that.
He did.
And here we are, right?
Here we are.
That's a whole separate discussion, but it's interesting.
That's not a good solution, Avery. The cocaine would be a bad solution.
So, anyways, I know we're just about out of time, but I think this has been a fantastic symposium. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank Ovid Megrady for his perspectives and really sharing with us, how important the rule of law is as a key enabler to be able to change where we are, to deal with the structural racism and all those pieces that are very challenging that we can't change. We as advocates and surgeons and healthcare providers can change. But I think that we're all leaving a little bit smarter today and a little bit more aware. And I think that we've seen through some of these discussions today how impactful a little bit of awareness might be in being able to change what tomorrow might look like. So I want to thank you all and have a great evening. Get home to your families, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit more over the years to come. Thanks, everybody.